We're now on the top of Daf Yuda Amid Beis, and the Gemara said that from the psak of Rabbi Yehuda with regard to the status of a sukkah that generates a chiyuv maser and a shem tevel, it must be that Rabbi Yehuda considers a sukkah to be a bias deoraisa. And then once again, we're confused about Rabbi Yehuda's position in the Lishkas Farhedrin, where it was clear that he was talking about an obligation that's only Rabbanon, and Rabbi Yehuda was not willing to identify and classify a Lishkas Farhedrin, the 7 days of the week, as a bias doraisa, and yet a sukkah is doraisa. Elomar Abaye, B'Shiva, during the 7 days, to Kuliyal Malo Plidim Chayev. Certainly, when the Kohen Gadol is living in the Lishkas Farhedrin for that week before Yom Kippurim, it was a chiyuv doraisa to put up a mezuzah. And ki pligi b'shar yemos hashana. And although the Lishkas Farhedrin is a small fraction of the year, it's only 1 week, nevertheless, that's enough to generate a chiyuv doraisa, just like, according to Rabbi Yehuda, we proved from Maser that sukkah is chayiv mezuzah deoraisa, meaning that a sukkah has the status of a bias deoraisa, and therefore generates a chiyuv mezuzah, and therefore during the 7 days of Sukkot and the 7 days of quarantine, when the Kohen Gadol lives in the Lishkas Farhedrin, there's a chiyuv doraisa, according to Rabbi Yehuda, of mezuzah. Ki pligi b'shar yemos hashana. The machlokas that was mentioned in this brisa reflects the rest of the year, the balance of the year. Rabbanan Savri, Gazrina, and Shari Mos Hashanah to Shiva. We should require a mezuzah in the Lishkas Farhedrin the entire year, because if you're only going to require it during 7 days, then the possibility arises that maybe they'll forget to put up the mezuzah. So to guarantee that they won't forget to put up the mezuzah during the 7 days of quarantine before Yom Kippur, they required a mezuzah the entire year round. Rabbi Yehuda Sovar lo gazrinon. Rabbi Yehuda says that we're not afraid of this gzeira, and if that be the case, then we're going to say that according to Abaye, the way he's presenting it here, Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanakhama agree that there's a chiyuv doraisa to put a mezuzah in the Lishkas Farhedrin. And that's because during that week, it certainly is a bias and it generates a chiyuv mezuzah. And forget about a winter house, a summer house. Everybody would consider that that is, during the time you live there, a chiyuv doraisa. It's a full-fledged bias. The machlokas here is about the rest of the year. And the Chachamim say we need a mezuzah the rest of the year in the case of Lishkas Farhedrin because of the gzeira of Shayimos Hashanah to Shiva, and Rabbi Yehuda has a different logical reason for this gzeira. Rav objects to the presentation of Abaye v'sukas achag b'chag toni. We quoted a Mishnah, and the Mishnah says that during the course of Sukkot, there is no mezuzah, no chiyuv mezuzah, and the chachamim it was only Rabbi Yehuda who said yechayev in mezuzah. You just told me, Abaye, that b'shiva kuliyam lo plidim chayev. Everybody agrees, even the chachamim, that is a chiyuv doraisa to put a mezuzah in a sukkah. That's not so, because the Mishnah itself says that there's machlokas on this point, and whereas Rabbi Yehuda says yechayev mezuzah during sukkahs, the Chachamim disagree; they reject it, and the Mefarshim explained that Abaye was focused on the brisa. He wasn't interested in the Mishnah. There are actually 3 shittas over here. The Mishnah is reflecting the shita of the Chachamim of the Mishnah. The brisa is talking about the Tanakhama. That's a different shita. But Elam, Rava is going to reinterpret the entire discussion here between the Tanakhama Rabbi Yehuda regarding mezuzah. Everybody exempts a mezuzah in the case of Lishkas Farhedrin during the course of the year. Kipligi Shiva. The machlokes is during the 7 days, and we're going to analyze this machlokes in a two-pronged way. First of all, with regard to the 7 days of preach of the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur, the Lishkas Farhedrin, and secondly, with regard to the 7 days of Sukkah. Sukkah time of Lechud, Lishka time of Lechud. And now Rava wants to reconcile the contradiction between the Bryce and the Mishnah, and he says the following. There's one dispute, one machlokes, which is recorded in the Mishnah with regard to Sukkah. That's chada, that's one principle. And that has nothing to do with the other machlokes in the Brisa regarding Lishkas Farhedrin. There are two different principles that are at stake over here, and they're not connected one to the other. The issue of Sukkah and the issue of Farhedrin are two separate independent issues. Sukkah time Lechud. Now we'll explain the machlokus in the Mishnah with regard to Sukkah. Rabbi Yehuda L'Tamei says, Rava, now you have to know Rabbi Yehuda's Shita with regard to Sukkah. Now, when I say with regard to Sukkah, I'm not talking about mezuzah per se. I mean, mezuzah is going to be impacted by this. But what is the structure of a mezuzah? And this is a sugya at the very beginning of Masechet Sukkah. And the Chachamim say that a Sukkah Gavoa Esrim Amma is possible. If it's above 20 Amma, it's possible. Why? Because it's not Roy L'diras Aroy. And a Sukkah, by definition, has to be a temporary dwelling. Once you build it 20 Ammas high, you're going to have to structure some real strong walls to hold up a sukkah that's 20 amas high, and then it becomes a diras keva. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. The sky's the limit. You can have the tallest structure and the schach can be on top. I couldn't care less, says Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Because a sukkah is a diras keva. And therefore, if we take Rabbi Yehuda's shita with regard to sukkah, namely that sukkah is a diras keva, now we apply it to the spin-off, namely to mezuzah, we begin to understand why Rabbi Yehuda is in the Mishnah is machayev sukkah in a mezuzah, because it's a diras keva. It's a full-fledged structure. Rabbanan l'taymayu di'ami sukkah diras haroy b'inu v'lo machayev mezuzah. We understand that the Rabbanan are consistent with their opinion. They hold that a sukkah cannot be 20 amas high because that makes it into a diras keva, and a sukkah has to be a diras haroy. If a sukkah is a diras haroy, it's not really a bias, and hence it doesn't generate a chiyuv mezuzah. And that's the machlokes in the Mishnah between Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. Now we move on to the machlokes between Chacham and Rabbi Yehuda regarding Lishkas Farhedrin. Whole different issue. Lishka time Lechud, a separate independent principle that's at stake. Rabbanan Savri, Dira, Bal Karcha Shmei Dira. When a person has to move into a house because he's obligated to, but he doesn't want to live there. For example, with regard to the Kohen Gadol, I mean, he has his own home. He'd rather stay home, but he's required, according to the law, to pack out of his house for 1 week and live in the Lishkas Farhedrin. That's called a Dira Bal Karcha. He's obligated to do so. And in such a case, the Rabbanan say that he's potter. Again, he's potter in Sukkah for one reason. He's potter Lishkas Farhedrin for an entirely different reason. The P'tur of Sukkah is because it's a Diras Haroy. According to Chacham, it's not a Diras Keva. And hence, it doesn't have a shame bias to generate a Chiyuv Mezuzah. In the case of Lishkas Farhedrin, it's an entirely different logic. And that is that even though it is Dira Bal Karcha, but Dira Bal Karcha, Shmei Dira, and that's considered a Dira, and therefore the Chiyuv Mezuzah, in this case of Lishkas Farhedrin, is a result of the fact that it's a Diras Keva. So again, if we go back to the Chachamim, with regard to sukkah, the Chachamim say that you're potter from a mezuzah in sukkah. That's because it's a diras aroy. However, with regard to lishkas farhedrin, that's a full-fledged structure. It's more than 20 amas high. Who cares how high it is? It's a permanent structure. But if you ask me, it's a dira bal karcha. So again, he's moving into this dira bal karcha against his will. In other words, it's because of the chiyuv. That doesn't upset, according to the Chachamim, the status of the lichkas farhedrin as a bias. And Rabbi Yehuda says no. Dira bal karcha lo shmei dira. And therefore, says Rava, the entire enterprise of mezuzah with regard to lichkas farhedrin, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is all dirabanan. Rabbi Yehuda savar dira bal karcha lo shmei dira umidirabanan hu detakinu. And as we indicated when we started this almost, that we have to see why, according to Rabbi Yehuda, did the Chachamim enact a requirement of a mezuzah in the lichkas farhedrin. And now it all comes to the fore, because after all, dira bal karcha lav shmei dira. So the lichkas farhedrin is clearly not beischa as far as mezuzah is concerned. Even for the Kohen Gadol who lives there for a week, he is being compelled to live there. That's not dira. Rabbanan instituted takana. Rabbanan zekinu shelo yomru Kohen Gadol chavush bebeis asurim. You know, when people look at a home, the first thing they notice is the mezuzah. I remember as a child, we used to go around collecting from door to door for Karen Kayemes L'Yisrael. I don't know if you remember that. And the first thing we looked at before we rang the bell was there a mezuzah? That's how you identify a bias. And when you invite someone into your bias, they come in, they see the mezuzah, they know they're going into your home and you are hosting them. But there's something called a jail. And a jail, which is a beis hasurim, is not a home. And we don't put a mezuzah up on a jail. And if people see that the lichkas farhedrin has no mezuzah, in their minds, they don't see it as a place where the Kohen Gadol is living Yoma v'layla for a week with his friends and his rebbeim who are teaching him and so forth. It's not. It's a beis hasurim. Where's the mezuzah? Only a jail doesn't have a mezuzah. And now the Gemara says, "Man tanele laha de taner rabbanan." Here we're going to turn for a moment to Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. Kol hasha'arim. We have a brisa that says that all the gates in the Beis Hamikdash complex, there was a mezuzah in one shar and only in one shar. Because the law of mezuzah is that if you have a shar that opens up into a chotzer, and the chotzer in turn opens up into a bias, that shar needs a mezuzah. And in the case of shar Nikanor, which led into the chotzer, so to speak, of the Mikdash, meaning into the Azara, it's a gate that requires a mezuzah. Shalifnimi menu. And what are you saying? That it's a gate that leads into the Azara, but the Azara has to lead into a bias. I mean, you can't say that a shar is chayav in mezuzah if the shar does not lead into a bias. And the answer is it does lead into a bias. And which bias does it lead into? Lifnim mimenu lishkas farhedrin. You enter into the Azara through the shar Nikanor, and you move towards the lishkas farhedrin. So you see that the shar is a shar to a chotzer, which is a chotzer around a bias, and therefore shar Nikanor requires a mezuzah. That can only make sense according to the Rabbanon. Lema Rabbanon even lo Rabbi Yehuda, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, the only reason the lishkas farhedrin required a mezuzah is shelo yomru. It's exer. They shouldn't say that it is a beis hasurim. But then the shar Nikanor doesn't lead into a bias. because dira bal karcha, according to Rabbi Yehuda, lav shmei dira, and the only reason we put up a mezuzah is gzeira shemi yomru. So why does the Shara Nikanor require mezuzah? It must be the Rabbanan Shita who hold that the Lishkas Farhedrin is considered a base dira, even though it's Bal Karcho. And now the Shara Nikanor leads into the Azara, which in turn spills into a bias. Di Rabbi Yehuda, Gufa Gzera. The only reason why Lishkas Farhedrin requires a mezuzah is a Gzera. Now you're going to tell me that we're going to establish another gzera built on top of a gzera. In other words, the whole requirement, the entire requirement of the mezuzah in the Lishkas Farhedrin according to Rabbi Yehuda is a gzera. Now you're going to add another gzera on top of that, and you're going to require mezuzah in the Shar Nikanor? That doesn't make sense. And the Gemara rejects this and says, Afilu Tamer Abanon. Afilu Tamer, Rabbi Yehuda, I can reconcile this with Rabbi Yehuda, even though Lishkas Farhedrin itself is a gzera. Nevertheless, we're going to apply the logic of Kula Chad Gzera. If we want to require mezuzah, the Lishkas Farhedrin, for the gzera, that people shouldn't call it a Beis Hasurim, then what we're doing is we are upgrading the status of Lishkas Farhedrin, Midrabanon, to that of a bias. Once it's a bias, then all the pieces of the puzzle fall into place, and the natural repercussion is that any shard that ultimately leads into that bias is obligated in the mitzvah of mezuzah. So this is not a violation of the principle of lo gazrin on gzera l'gzera. This is an application of the principle called kula chad gzera. And we'll end the shir by mentioning the Gemara in Masechet Chulin with regard to ha'ala ala shulchan of basar of b'chalav. Are you allowed to put meat, chicken meat and milk on the same table? And the answer is no. Even though chicken with milk is the Rabbanan, we're holding like Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So now, even if he would mix the milk and the chicken together, Chastrom, and eat it, it's only a Rabbanan. Now you're telling me they can't put it on the table together because, so the Gemara asks Zera, the Gemara answers Kula Chad Zera. When they upgraded oaf to the level of basar and gave it the status of basar b'chalav, then everything else fits into place. All the pieces of the puzzle now are natural repercussions, which means that the gzera of Allah will apply to any kind of basar b'chalav. Whenever there's basar b'chalav, it could be basar b'chalav d'oraisa, it could be basar b'chalav d'Rabbanan. Once it's considered basar b'chalav, then you're not allowed to put them on the same table. And that's what the Gemara is applying here to justify, according to Rabbi Yehuda, a mezuzah in the Shara Nikanor, which leads into the Lishkas Farhedrin, which itself is a bias only midrabanan and requires a mezuzah midrabanan gzeira shemi yomru, and it's kula chada gzeira. So this is where we're going to stop for today, and we're up to Tanu Rabbanan on Daf Yud Aleph Amid Aleph, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down from the top of the.
Sure.